Okay, welcome back, everyone, on topic 4, displays. All right. Okay, so the next 3 subtopics are subtopics. So we have some design principles. I'm going to talk about human-centered design principles that come from your textbook. And so there's a lot more detail about these principles in there, but they're nice, and they can break them down according to these 13 human-centered principles. There's a few other ones from other sources as well, so I've got these in 1, 2, 3 parts. All right, so here we go. These 13 principles of human-centered display design. This, again, comes from the Lee et al. Text. They have these principles. They may be in a slightly different order because they've been refined and detailed over the years. But I'm going to roughly talk about the principles on the left side of this screen here in this subtopic, and then I'll do another video with the other 6, excuse me. So there's 13. So today we're going to talk about perceptual principles, supporting perception through display design, and then mental model principles. So each of them, involve various cognitive functions, because again, a display is effective if it is able to successfully convey a message to a human. And so that's going to have to be perceived and interpreted, according to the human's cognitive faculties. All right, so first, perceptual principles. There we go. All right, very first one. And these are numbered 1 through 13. And that matters because for your homework, you're going to have to make a table where you number these principles 1 through 13. So we know what you're talking about. So the very first one. So perception is all about having humans make sense of something in the physical world. So it's different from sensation, but sensation happens when there's an activation of our receptors, like when the retina is struck by light and they start to change their action potential patterns, their neural discharge pattern. There's a lot more that goes on, though, after sensation before perception. So all of the aspects of interpreting something so that you have a meaningful experience, as opposed to just random disorganized sensory data, is because of the process of perception. So how do we support human perception? We make things work with their senses. So making things legible, so the principles we've talked about in the previous few topics on making, contrast and illumination at the right level, and the size and the acuity needs to be, potentially thought about. On the auditory side, we can describe similar sort of, analogous properties that are required to have a easy to interpret, easy to perceive auditory message. I could probably put / olfactable / tasteable / all of the other senses, and there are design features that make them, I think, more distinguishable in those various channels. All right, so all of these principles, we talk about how do you make a good visual experience, how do you make a good auditory experience, which we'll talk about in a later topic in this course. Those all apply here. Principle number 1, make those things work with human senses. All right. Number 2, avoid absolute judgment. All right, so here we go. There is a reference I'm going to make a few times in this course to this concept of the magical number 7 ± 2. So that's the full phrase, the magical number 7 ± 2. And the reason that's magical is because there's a whole bunch of human psychology that can be described by the number 7 ± 2. And one of them is working memory capacity. So in topic 8, when we talk about memory and the basic functions of memory, the capacity of working memory is essentially what we have to work with when we see, hear, otherwise receive a message and are thinking about it and are processing it. Now, once it's in our head and we're not taking in additional data to supplement that message, we've only got our memories, our memory functions to work for us. So one of the ways that limitation manifests itself is that people are not very good at calling into working memory and making distinctions in an absolute sense with more than 7 plus or minus 2 items. Okay, so 5 to 7 we'll say here because we don't want to go on the high end there. But these are roughly the number of different, if we can talk about visual properties here at least, the number of different levels within a given dimension that humans can reliably distinguish in an absolute sense. Let me give a very clear example. Color, okay? So if I told you I'm about to hold up a marker and you have to tell me if it is red, green, blue, yellow, orange, or purple, I suppose. Most of you, is assuming there's no issues with color anomalous vision, most of you, I'd hold something up and you'd get exactly what I thought you would get. Okay, so I gave you 7 different. What did I give you? Maybe only 6. Maybe only 6. Yeah. So, but that's still 5 to 7. So I gave you this many absolute possibilities. I hold up one, and you're going to be okay. But if I told you, hey, there are 24 different potential colors here, so I'm going to go with turquoise and opal and, everything in between. Sorry, just time out here. Camera there and back, I guess. Okay, so if I chose all of those, if I had 24 different colors, and I said, hey, which color is this? Now you'd be thinking, all right, well, I have a harder time telling if that's blue-green or green-blue or teal or aqua or etc. And it's not about the distinguishing necessarily of hues, because if I were to give you here's the box of Crayola crayons and you can match it up, well, now you can probably tell me which one it is, right? But that's not what I was asking. I was asking in an absolute sense. You don't get a key to review. It's going to hold up something, a crayon or a marker, and you got to tell me what it is. And you got to identify it, in an absolute sense. You don't get to say, hey, is that bluer than the last one you showed me? That's a relative comparison. This is an absolute comparison. You get one chance, right? So if that's the case, now imagine other things like, I'm walking through an industrial facility and I have one of several colors that may be displayed that relate to the safety level, for example. 5 to 7 are the range of those colors that I can reasonably, expect people to identify and recognize. Okay. And people are much better at relative judgment than they are absolute judgment. This is my own personal sort of a struggle. This is my own, my gadgety, naive and hobbyist electronicist problem. Okay, so this, if anybody's ever worked with resistors, this is a common way. Well, there is an international code with how these resistors are printed, which tells us their value. And this matters quite a bit, because if you misinterpret one of these colors, you can be off by an order of magnitude. And sometimes that order of magnitude is the difference between everything working great and everything being 10 times worse. Right. So if you were to look at, and there are different standards. This is the 4 bar standard, the 4 band standard. But I will tell you the hardest distinction for me is between red and orange. Now, I don't know how representative these projected reds and oranges are to you right now, but I can tell you, once I go out to my mad science lab and get a couple of resistors and look at them real close, it is very difficult for me to tell the difference sometimes in an absolute sense. Okay, so if I just look at a resistor, I'm like, what is this? I'm looking at this one and I'm like, I think this is 10 mega ohms, because I won't go through the math on this, but it matters here. The orange, if it's orange or red, it's the difference of times 100 or times 1,000. So it is a more order of magnitude different. Makes a huge difference in your project, and it's really hard to tell in an absolute sense. So what I always have to do is I have to hold up I have to hold up the resistor to my card with my color-coded card, because I can compare relative hues. That is an effective thing I can do. In an absolute sense, though, if I only see this resistor and I don't have this comparison key here, I am judging in an absolute sense. You got one chance, is that orange or red, and if it's ambiguous, that's going to be potentially a problem. All right, so that was principle 2. Don't avoid absolute judgment. If you need to use absolute judgment, your limits should be 5 to 7. I would call this maybe I don't have absolute judgment if I can assume that a key like this is available. All right. Third principle, principle 3, top-down processing. Now, when we talk about how humans take in information from their surroundings, we'll talk about top-down influences in attention and bottom-up influences in attention. Top-down, if you think about everything from my brain down, this is me and all the agency of me, all of my intelligence, all my expectations, all of my cleverness and my understanding and my knowledge, all of those applied towards the task at hand. Okay, so it's the opposite of saying what the task brings to me, the generic human. The top-down processing is, well, what is uniquely in my head that is going to affect how I process these things? And very strong amongst that are my past experience and how that drives my expectations of what I'm processing. Okay, so expectations can have a very strong effect on how humans experience something. If they expect something, they're gonna be more likely to perceive it according to their expectation, even if it doesn't match. So here's my example. If I've got a bunch of checklists, maybe I'm, trying to fire up my helicopter here, and I've got, okay, well, switch A should be off, good. Switch B should be off, switch C, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Switch D should be off, should be on. So if I don't, if I get in a mode where maybe my expectation is, I think I said the opposite, but if my expectation is A should be on, good, check. B should be on, check. C should be on, check. D should be on, check. And if I miss, no, D should be something that you're not expecting. So an unexpected entry is here. I'm higher than 0 likelihood to miss it. Okay, so this is one of those clues for, is the system encouraging errors? Or is the system designed in such a way to minimize the likelihood humans would commit errors? I would say this is a good example of a system-induced error, right? So what do we do about it? Well, we overcome people's top-down expectation-based influences with stronger bottom-up environment-based influences. So we make the different thing look way different. So we make it stand out a lot more so from the background. That way, even if I have an expectation of what I'm going to read, I see this disruptive, attention-seeking different pattern, and it's going to make it more likely I will see, oh, wait, this is a different item in my list. So we use more bottom-up, higher salience. There's a term for you. Salience, I like to use that term. Salience refers to how much something sticks out from the background. I think you're going to hear that term again in a later topic. All right, so the D and the off, these have just been made more salient by changing color, by making it larger. Principle number 4, redundancy gain. Okay, so this is a recurring topic also. I like to make reference to redundancy in a lot of different contexts for human factors, because it's both good and bad at times. If you say, hey, you're being redundant, that's usually saying, oh, you're not really giving me more information, you're just saying more words, or you're just repeating the message in a different way. And while that sounds like a negative thing, sometimes that's a very positive thing if your goal is to ensure that message gets across. So if I really, really want to get you to understand these 13 display design principles, I could use redundant methods. I could say, read the whole textbook, then watch this video, then come and meet me in office hours. And I could say the same message every time, But if I deliver it in slightly different ways, it increases the chance of it getting through to a given receiver. Okay. And this is, we talked about with color anomalous vision, and my friend who, hey, how is it that you know when to go and when to stop if you can't tell red from green? And you say, well, it's always, there's all these other clues, there's all these other cues, and one of them being the position of the light. And so this is redundantly encoding go or stop by the hue of the light and by the position of the light. Two different dimensions, entirely individually. Each dimension carries the full message, but we encode it in two different ways so that more people, including those who maybe have some disabilities with some of these dimensions, or otherwise are busy, let's say, for example, you are working all the time and don't have time to sit down and read a textbook. Well, then it's pretty nice that Ferris maybe records his lectures and I can listen to them while I'm on the train or whatever. So redundant ways, offering more different ways to engage the people who are receiving the messages from the displays. This is also a lot of where the research that I do comes into play, because a lot of the display research I do involves weird sensory channels like vibrotactile displays or olfactory displays. And there is some benefit to that if you, for example, are driving a car and your vision is in high demand. And maybe also your audition is in high demand. And so, well, maybe we have some other channels that we can get through to the receiver a little more readily. All right, so 4 principles down. Here we go. Good. All right. Multisensory gain is actually more than, if we're talking about redundancy here, right? So if I have a visual medium and I can supplement that with an auditory signal, when I combine the visual and the auditory signals together, we actually get this. What you're seeing here, this is the superior colliculus, which is a neural structure in the brain that basically increases in activity when you have concurrent sensory streams from multiple different senses. So what you're seeing here, this is like neural activity, and this is showing, okay, if I just show the video, we get this much activity. If I just play the audio, I get this much activity. But if I play the visual and the audio together, I get this 1,000, 1,200% increase in neural activity at the superior colliculus, right? So this is our neural indication of the benefits of potentially, even for this one person, having multiple sensory streams that confirm an otherwise ambiguous message. Okay, so this is like really raw. This is like the first book at the top of my pile when I wrote my dissertation. Stein and Meredith in 1993. I'll tell you, now it's not just about research though, because I apply this in my everyday life. I've actually got my family to do this as well without making fun of me anymore. But I am a firm believer in the English subtitling experience. And that may make me sound, really like old or something, but I'll tell you what, especially if you're a casual TV viewer, movie viewer, it's amazing how much more you pick up if you allow yourself, the subtitles there to accompany the auditory, especially if maybe the auditory is ambiguous, like if somebody has a thick accent, like Arnold. Okay. All right. So I do this with everything now. Used to make my wife crazy, but now my whole family they're all converted. We're all old. All right. Last of the perceptual principles. There's 5 of these. Maybe my favorite because of this picture that I get to use to illustrate it. So discriminability. If things need to be separated, if they need to not be confused with each other, they need to look different. And there are ways to make things look similar and ways to make things look different. And we can quantify the degree of similarity. And sometimes this is a nice way to determine, okay, well, which of our display elements do we really need to focus on, differentiating here? So one of the ways you can study or you can quantify that is to look at the ratio of similar items to dissimilar items. Okay, so if I have a string of characters 48 and 58, to one of these numbers is the same number, one is different, so you'd say, I don't know, it's 50% similarity. But if you look at this one, AJB648, AJB658, only one number is different. Otherwise, we have 6 or 5, similar ones. So we have a 5-to-1 ratio. So much higher similarity there. And so that would, be one that was higher priority for renaming or making look dissimilar if they needed to be distinguished. So assuming these two things would need to be distinguished, I would look at them and say, well, they're the same yellow hue. They have the same label, the same brand label there, same font, okay, well, the one thing that's different, they're not the same height. Another thing that's different, the picture at the bottom. But what, look at the ratio of similarity to dissimilarity and tell me that this is a perfectly distinguishable thing, and that you wouldn't, maybe in a hurry when you're trying to cook something delicious, somehow you also store your fly poison with your spray, with cooking spray. I hope not, but you can see, right? So these are obviously two things that should not be confused, but maybe are not doing enough to be visually discriminable. What do we do about it? And we have cases like this. Same thing like with the top-down processing principle. We make the things that need to be noticed more noticeable. Okay, so we find the dissimilar element, the unique numeral in this string, and we make it stand out. We make it more salient. It's larger, it's a different color, it's bold, it's a different font. It's some way to stand out from the background more so. Okay, so the case study I like to bring up with this is a major problem in healthcare. It used to be bigger. Well, I don't know if it's bigger or smaller now, but we are addressing it in a number of ways. But we have these, the medical system we have in the world here involves a lot of new research that creates new life-saving drugs and like world-changing drugs. And then they give them these like 17-letter Latin base root, these very difficult to parse words, and that's the name of them. And they have like legal reasons why they have to be named these different things. But what it ultimately does is it creates a lot of similar chemical drugs that do very different things, but because they're similar chemically, they're spelled very similar and they're pronounced in a similar way. And now when you add in humans, and you have a stressed out surgeon who says, nurse, I need 10 milligrams of vincristine right now, we got a crashing patient. And that nurse goes over to the drug cabinet and starts surfing through the V's. And there's about 150 different drugs that start with V. Okay, so let me look for the VIs. Okay, well, here's V. Oh, and then what happened? I thought I got the vincristine, but I actually got the vinblastine. And as much as you think, yeah, that sounds like a very reasonable confusion, that also can kill people, right? And in fact, this one example down here, vancomycin and vecuronium, those don't look as similar as some of these other ones, but this was a real life case study that that really stuck with me through my life. So I had a surgeon and PhD in engineering, impressive, and astronaut at Michigan, named Jim Bajan, tells a story about when he was a surgeon, and it wasn't him, maybe it was at his hospital or something, but there was a confusion between these two drugs. And when a doctor called, hey, I want vancomycin, I need vancomycin for this patient. Vancomycin is an antibiotic. It's the kind of thing that after surgery you might use so that there's no infection in the wound, for example. Vecuronium is a muscle relaxant, and that is used to induce paralysis for anesthesia. And I'm laughing, but this was a case where instead of antibiotics, somebody got an extreme dose of a powerful muscle relaxant, and it killed this patient. And this happens. We talked in topic 1 about the 98,000 preventable medical errors every year. This is just one example. And if it sounds extreme, just know that something like that probably just happened somewhere in this country. It's frequent enough, and it's a sign that, you know, we need closer attention from what's going on with humans when we expect them to be flawless in these systems. So here's actually, so the story with the vancomycin and vecuronium would have come before the 2001 solution approach here. So the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, recognized that drug confusion, people mixing up drugs in the operating room, was a big problem. People are dying because of it. And they said, well, you know, rather than just tell people, hey, just look more closely next time, that's not going to solve it. Let's look for design solutions that will make it less likely for humans to confuse these very believably confusable things. Okay. So two ways the FDA did that. They basically installed this system that is currently in place today. They first said, all right, if you've got these drug names that have common words, common roots, common, you know, aspects to them, you need to find the unique part of those names and make them tall man lettering. Okay, so they will take the BLAS in vinblastine and the CRIS in vincristine, and those will be the bolded, large, different letters, just like this, highlighting dissimilarity, just like that. That's what the FDA did with drugs, and they made them, that became a universal requirement here. They also used color coding, and I'm going to talk about color coding later in this topic. It's interesting, but once you have a reliable color code, now you can imagine if I'm reaching for what I expect to be an antibiotic, you know, a nice white, where antibiotics are white, I think. No, I don't see them, but it's antibiotic. Yeah. Okay. So just assume it's miscellaneous white, right? And then, you know, a powerful, dangerous, do not confuse it muscle relaxant like red, you know, the vecuronium here. So that ends up being much more obvious. It's an additional redundant cue, the color, in addition to the wording, that helps people realize, you know, which drug they're working with. Okay, so that is the 5 principles of the 5 perceptual principles for human-centered display design. Moving on to mental model principles, and we have 2 of them. So the mental model principle, so when we talk about perception, that's about getting that information into the human brain in a understandable way, making sure that they don't misperceive things so that, you know, confusable things get misrepresented. All right, mental model is, all right, now that I've processed that data, I'm making sense of it with respect to what those data represent in the real world. And so we talk about how humans think of the real world as their mental model, okay? And so if I think about what's the temperature like outside, the way I think about temperature maybe is in terms of how much I shiver or how hot I am or whatever. But it might also be, you know, I think of high temperatures and low temperatures. And when I say high and low, it sort of conveys already this spatial aspect, high and low, like literal positions. And that comes from the way that, you know, at least in the United States, that we talk about the temperature outside. We say high temperatures and low temperatures, just like if we had a mercury thermometer, you know, the temperature is higher when the mercury expands and goes higher up the gauge here, and lower when it's down here. So there is the way that we think about this dimension is we've culturally associated it with this instrument, up and down, and higher and lower. There's nothing up or down about the air energy, you know, the molecules of air vibrating at a certain frequency, which is how, you know, how heat is expressed basically. But this is how the human mental model might fit this. So if I want to convey temperature, I convey it, you know, in maybe an imagery that is up and down like this. If I wanted to do a bar graph, let's say, of temperature, and I oriented it left and right, or in some other shape, it wouldn't fit my normal mental model for how people would think about temperature. So pictorial realism is if I'm displaying something static, okay? Static, like what's the temperature right now, this snapshot in time, okay? And so the image that I use, the pictorial elements that I use to convey the message should map people's mental model of that dimension. Okay, so up and down map to how I think about temperature. That's my mental model. So pictorial realism is for the static display. Now, if I've got a display that's dynamic, it's moving, an extension of this is I expect the display to move. The dynamics of the display should match the dynamics of the system that's being represented in a mapping way. So if I'm in, well, let me give this example. Okay, so altitude, right? So an aircraft, right? If I'm flying in an aircraft and I'm looking at my altimeter, it's telling me how high off the earth I am. And I do something with the aircraft where I expect to be gaining in altitude. I expect the altitude to be going up. I want to then see a display that shows me not only is the altitude going up, but it's going up in a way that maps to the way I think about the system and where I am in the system. That maps to my thought of my aircraft being above the earth and being represented in this altimeter dial. Okay, so let me show you an example here. All right, let's say it's a digital readout. I'm gonna do that one more time. And this is hundreds, let's say this is hundreds of feet above. No, that doesn't make sense. All right, it's 100, you're 600 feet above the earth. Let's just say this is your altimeter. Okay, so I can have a digital readout like this, great. Well, I would say this doesn't do a very good job of illustrating the principle of the moving part, because I'm changing altitude right now. I'm pulling up, right? I'm going up. Now, the dynamics of the changes in this display do not map naturally in a way to how I think about the fact that my aircraft is going up. And maybe one thing you caught is that I'm at 500, 501, 503, and then suddenly, boom, way up to 615. That sort of aspect, that dynamic, is missed if I'm only looking at a bunch of digital readouts, okay? So this representation, just 3 digits changing, is not represented in a way that really helps the human realize, oh, I just went way up, ascended way high really fast, okay? So the dynamics are not well captured. All right, option 2, watch this. So I'm flying along, and now I have a fixed scale, and I've got my index. My index moves up and down. Now, this is great, because now what I can see is great. If I'm going up, well, that's great, because I see that arrow move right up along with me. So dynamically, the way that the display changes maps very well with my mental model of how I expect it to change. I'm bringing the aircraft to go up, and the arrow goes up. That maps very nicely, right? Problem with this is, what happens when I get up to 15,000 feet? Am I going to have, one continuous, very, very long scale that goes, the entire height of my cockpit so that I can get to 1,500 from here? Sorry, what did I say? 15,000 from here? And so you say, well, come on, Ferris, you can make the scale change or whatever, but how should the scale change? How should the scale move? Okay, so option 3. Oh, here we go. That's like we were saying, right? So now I've got a nice constrained space. I've got the fullness of the display in this one little readout. And as the altimeter changes, as I rise in altitude, the numbers go up. So it's like that thing is, it's similar to this, only instead of the index moving, now the index is fixed and the scale moves. All right, but watch this. What's the problem with this? Especially with regard to the principle of the moving part. And it is that I would say, if I am rising in altitude, the direction, the animation here, the direction of this display is a downward movement. Watch again. It moves down, right? And so can you imagine there may be a mismatch there? Now, I know some of you are pilots and you're thinking, no, that's not a problem at all. Imagine some of you are not pilots and you still might think, yeah, but you pull up, that's weird. All right, just bear with me here and say, if I'm thinking that my aircraft is going up, but my display is a downward motion, that's potentially a mismatch with my mental model. That's potentially a problem, a source of error, or a source of at least confusion or extra cognitive work for a human. So here's my last demonstration here. I have got something that changes such that when you raise an altitude, the numbers do go up, and the direction of motion, the dynamics of the display also move upwards. So the principle of the moving part is well satisfied in that case. Okay, that's the first 7 principles. Tune in for the final 6 in part 2. Thanks, everyone.